High in the hills of Eastern California, there's a town that looks as if it was paused rather than abandoned. The buildings still stand. The streets are still there. Windows look out over nothing in particular. At first glance, Bodie does not feel like a ruin. It feels unfinished. There was a time when this place was loud, not with celebration, but with purpose. According to historical records, by the late 1870s, Bodie had grown from a mining camp into a full town almost overnight. Gold had been discovered nearby, and word traveled fast. Very fast. Men arrived first, then families, then businesses. Wooden houses were built quickly, not to last forever, but to last long enough. Stores opened. Saloons multiplied. A school was constructed. Churches followed. For a brief moment, Bodie felt permanent. People did not come here to pass through. They came to stay. Newspapers at the time described Bodie as a booming gold town, filled with opportunity and danger in equal measure. But beneath the noise, there was a quieter belief shared by almost everyone who arrived. This place would hold. Gold gave the town a reason to exist. And as long as the gold lasted, so would Bodie. What no one could clearly see was how fragile that balance really was. Tonight's story is not about legends or ghost stories. It is about a real town built on real gold and documented in real records. It is about how quickly Bodie rose and how slowly it disappeared. Not through disaster, not through a single dramatic moment, but through something much quieter. If you enjoy calm, documentary-style stories about real places and forgotten history, consider subscribing to the channel. This is the story of Bodie, a gold rush town that was never meant to be empty. The story of Bodie begins quietly, without celebration. In 1859, prospectors working in the remote hills near Mono Lake were not looking to build a town. They were following a familiar pattern, one repeated hundreds of times across the American West. They were looking for enough gold to justify staying another season. According to historical records from California mining reports, small deposits had been discovered in the area years earlier, but nothing significant enough to draw attention. Camps formed briefly, then dissolved. People moved on. Everything changed when a richer vein was identified. Gold was not found in dramatic quantities at first. There was no single strike that transformed the region overnight. Instead, confirmation spread slowly through word of mouth, letters, and mining claims filed quietly but steadily. By the early 1870s, the pattern became clear. This was not surface gold that could be exhausted quickly. It was deeper, more consistent, and that mattered. Gold that lasts changes behavior. Miners who believed they could work a claim for years began to build more permanent shelters. Wooden structures replaced tents. Supply routes were established. Businesses followed the miners, not the other way around. According to contemporary newspaper accounts, Bodie's population began to grow rapidly once investors became involved. Capital arrived alongside labor. Equipment grew heavier. Operations expanded. This was the moment Bodie stopped being a camp. It became a town. People brought families because the gold suggested stability. Schools were built because children were expected to stay. Churches appeared because people planned for ordinary life. Gold did not just attract individuals, it created infrastructure. Bodie's location, though isolated, was no longer seen as a problem. It was seen as a commitment. If people were willing to endure harsh winters, difficult travel, and distance from established cities, it meant they believed the reward justified permanence. For a time, they were right. The gold held. And as long as it did, Bodie continued to grow, not as a temporary settlement, but as a place people expected to call home. At its height, Bodie did not look like a temporary settlement. It looked like a functioning town. According to census data and local records from the late 1870s and early 1880s, Bodie's population reached several thousand residents. The exact number is debated, but what matters is not the count. It is the variety. This was not a place occupied only by miners. There were shopkeepers, teachers, clergy, families with children. Streets were lined with wooden buildings, many of them built quickly but arranged with intention. Stores sold everyday goods. Saloons served as gathering places, not just for drinking, but for news and conversation. A schoolhouse stood at the center of ordinary life. Children attended classes while their parents worked the mines. According to contemporary newspaper descriptions, Bodie had newspapers of its own, reporting on local events, mining output, and community disputes. This was a sign of confidence. Towns that expected to vanish did not invest in documentation. Life in Bodie followed a rhythm shaped by gold, but not consumed by it. People cooked meals. They argued with neighbors. They planned futures. The town faced difficulties, harsh winters, fires, and crime. But none of these seemed fatal at the time. Other gold towns had survived worse. What sustained Bodie was the belief that gold would continue to support daily life. As long as the mines produced, everything else made sense. Few people questioned what would happen if production slowed. Because in Bodie, gold did not feel temporary. It felt reliable. The decline of Bodie did not begin with collapse. It began with adjustment. According to mining reports from the late 1880s, gold production in the area became less predictable. The richest veins had already been worked, and extracting what remained required more effort, more equipment, and more investment. For a time, this did not alarm anyone. Gold towns were used to fluctuations. A slow month did not mean failure. A difficult season did not mean abandonment. But the balance had started to shift. Operating costs rose steadily. Returns became inconsistent. Mines that once supported dozens of workers began reducing shifts. Some closed temporarily. Others reopened under new ownership, hoping for better results. According to contemporary newspaper accounts, the tone of reporting changed subtly. Articles that once celebrated output and opportunity began to mention consolidation, restructuring, and uncertainty. None of this felt dramatic in the moment. People did not leave all at once. They left carefully. Families with options moved first. Businesses closed quietly. Homes were left furnished, not emptied. This was not panic. It was calculation. Those who stayed believed the downturn was temporary. Those who left believed they could return if conditions improved. In this way, Bodie began to thin rather than fall. The town did not disappear. It simply became less crowded. And with fewer people, everyday life grew quieter. Schools lost students. Shops shortened hours. Saloons served fewer conversations. Gold was still there, but it no longer supported certainty. The town remained standing, but its purpose had begun to weaken. Bodie was not dying yet, but it was no longer growing. What turned Bodie's slow decline into something irreversible was not a single event, but a change in expectations. By the 1890s, mining companies began to reassess their long-term plans. According to mining and investment records from the period, attention shifted toward newer discoveries elsewhere in the West. Capital followed opportunity, and Bodie was no longer at the center of it. This shift mattered more than the remaining gold. Gold can exist underground without sustaining a town above it. What keeps a town alive is confidence. As investment moved away, maintenance slowed. Equipment aged. Operations became smaller and more cautious. People noticed. Those who had stayed through earlier downturns began to reconsider. Not because life had become impossible, but because the future no longer felt predictable. According to contemporary accounts, many departures during this period were quiet and deliberate. People sold what they could. Others simply locked their doors. Some left furniture behind. Some left personal belongings exactly where they were. They did not see these departures as final. Many believed Bodie would stabilize again, perhaps at a smaller scale. They expected to return if conditions improved. This belief shaped how they left. Houses were not stripped. Businesses were not dismantled. The town was not erased, it was paused. Those who remained were often people with fewer alternatives. Older residents, long-term miners, business owners too invested to leave easily. For them, Bodie was no longer a place of opportunity. It was a place of attachment. But attachment alone could not reverse the broader pattern. As each year passed, fewer people stayed through the winter. Fewer children enrolled in school. Fewer services remained viable. The town did not collapse. It thinned until it could no longer sustain itself. Bodie was still standing, but it was no longer functioning as a town. The final years of Bodie as a living town were not marked by headlines. There was no official announcement, no moment when the town was declared finished. According to local records and later historical accounts, Bodie simply continued to lose people until almost no one was left to notice. By the early 20th century, only a small number of residents remained year-round. Most were older. Many had spent the majority of their lives in Bodie and had nowhere else they felt truly connected to. For them, leaving was not a practical decision. It was personal. Stores closed because there were no longer enough customers. The school shut down when there were too few children to justify a teacher. Church services became infrequent, then stopped entirely. Houses were abandoned one by one. Some residents locked their doors for the last time. Others did not bother. According to contemporary eyewitness accounts collected later, some of the final residents believed Bodie would always have at least a few people living there, that it would shrink but not disappear. They were wrong. As services vanished, daily life became increasingly difficult. Winter conditions grew harsher without infrastructure. Supplies became harder to obtain. Medical help was distant. Eventually, even those most attached to the town were forced to leave. When the last residents departed, they did not remove everything. Beds remained made. Dishes stayed on shelves. Clothing hung in closets. Bodie was not cleaned out. It was left as it was. The town crossed a quiet threshold. It was no longer inhabited, but it was also not destroyed. It entered a state that would later define it. Suspended. Most towns that lose their purpose are erased. Buildings are dismantled. Materials are reused. Land is repurposed. Bodie followed a different path. According to records later maintained by state authorities and local historians, the town was largely left alone after its final residents departed. Its remote location and harsh climate made redevelopment impractical. There was no economic reason to rebuild, and no strong reason to destroy. This absence of pressure became Bodie's preservation. Roofs collapsed slowly instead of being torn down. Wood aged naturally. Objects remained where they had been placed decades earlier. When visitors began arriving years later, they did not find a reconstructed town. They found a real one. Desks still held papers. Shelves still carried goods. Beds remained in place. Nothing had been arranged for display. The town was not frozen intentionally. It was simply never restarted. This is what gives Bodie its particular weight. It does not represent a single moment in history. It represents the end of many small plans. According to historical interpretations, Bodie's preservation was eventually formalized under the concept of arrested decay. The goal was not restoration, but stabilization, allowing the town to remain exactly as abandonment left it. This decision acknowledged something important. Bodie's value was not in what it could become again. It was in what it already was. A complete town that had quietly stopped functioning. No fire ended it. No flood erased it. It was left behind because the reason for staying no longer existed, and because no one returned to begin again. Walking through Bodie today feels less like visiting a ruin and more like entering a space that was never finished being used. This impression comes not from the buildings themselves, but from what remains inside them. According to inventories and photographic records maintained by park historians, many interiors were left largely intact when the town was abandoned. Furniture was not removed. Everyday objects were not gathered or sorted. They were simply left where they had last been used. In some houses, plates still sit on shelves. In others, beds remain pushed against walls, blankets folded as if someone expected to return later that day. School desks are still lined. Chalkboards remain in place. Handwritten notes were found exactly where they had been left. These are not displays arranged for visitors. They are interruptions. The objects in Bodie do not suggest panic. They suggest routine. People did not flee suddenly. They closed doors and assumed they would open them again. According to contemporary accounts and later historical analysis, this pattern is consistent throughout the town. Personal belongings were not treated as disposable. They were treated as temporary absences. Tools were left because they were expected to be used again. Clothing remained because it had not yet become unnecessary. Paperwork stayed because there was no reason to pack it. What makes these interiors powerful is their ordinariness. Nothing here was meant to become historic. Nothing was preserved with intention. Bodie's rooms hold the quiet evidence of lives that did not end dramatically. They simply moved elsewhere, one by one, until no one was left to continue them. The town was not emptied. It was paused mid-use. For many years after Bodie was abandoned, it existed in an uncertain state. It was no longer a town, but it was not yet history. According to state and regional records, Bodie was largely ignored through the early decades of the 20th century. It was too remote to be useful and too intact to be easily dismantled. Occasional visitors arrived, some out of curiosity, some out of nostalgia, some simply because the town was still standing. There was no formal protection at first. This meant that time, weather, and human presence all left their marks. Buildings aged. Objects deteriorated. Some items disappeared. Others remained untouched. What changed Bodie's fate was not a sudden appreciation, but a growing recognition that something rare still existed there. Most gold rush towns had vanished completely. Others had been rebuilt beyond recognition. Bodie remained neither restored nor erased. According to historical interpretations and preservation discussions from the mid-1900s, historians began to view the town not as a curiosity, but as a complete historical environment. Not a single building, not a monument, an entire town left as it had been. This perspective shifted the goal from restoration to restraint. Instead of rebuilding Bodie to show what it once looked like, authorities chose to stabilize what was already there. Walls were supported, roofs were reinforced, interiors were left undisturbed. Nothing new was added. Nothing old was removed unless absolutely necessary. The intention was clear. Bodie was not meant to feel alive again. It was meant to remain honest. By acknowledging the town's abandonment as its defining feature, preservation efforts respected the way Bodie had actually ended, not with drama, but with gradual absence. The town became valuable not because of what happened there, but because of what stopped happening. Life simply moved elsewhere, and Bodie was left behind exactly as it was. What makes Bodie different from many other ghost towns is not how it looks, but how it feels. There's no single moment you can point to and say, this is when it ended. No final disaster. No dramatic evacuation. According to historical analysis, Bodie did not fail. It simply outlived its reason for existing. Gold created the town, shaped its rhythm, and sustained its growth. When that gold could no longer support ordinary life, the town adjusted, then thinned, and finally stopped functioning. The silence that settled over Bodie was gradual. One less store open, one fewer family staying through winter, one more house closed and left untouched. Over time, silence became the town's most consistent feature. Wind moved through empty streets. Snow-covered buildings no one heeded anymore. Dust gathered on objects that had once been part of daily routine. Nothing in Bodie feels staged. There are no signs of urgency in the way things were left. No signs of fear. Only the quiet confidence of people who believed they would return, and the reality that they did not. According to preservation records, this is why visitors often describe Bodie as unsettling in a calm way. It does not feel tragic. It feels unresolved. The town does not tell a story of collapse. It tells a story of expectation slowly abandoned. And that may be harder to process. because it suggests that places do not always end when something goes wrong. Sometimes they end when the reason to stay quietly disappears. Bodie was built on gold, but it was not destroyed by its absence. It was left behind. The people who came here believed in continuity. They built homes, schools, and businesses because they expected life to continue in a familiar way. When that expectation faded, they did not erase the town. They stepped away from it. What remains today is not a ruin in the dramatic sense. It is a complete town, preserved by the simple fact that no one came back to begin again. Bodie reminds us that history is not always shaped by endings. Sometimes it is shaped by pauses that never resolve. If you enjoy calm, documentary-style stories about real places and forgotten history, consider subscribing to the channel. New stories explore how people, towns, and entire communities were shaped, and sometimes undone, by the quiet decisions they believed were temporary. And before you go, consider this question. Do places like Bodie feel abandoned to you? Or do they feel like they're still waiting for something that will never happen?